Death is not fatal, final, or permanent. Why are we doing this show, Tim? Tell me.
Because, as John Lennon rightly put it, death is no more important than getting out of one car and getting into another. If we look on the car as the body, then we leave one body, there's a little time in between, and we get into a new car and we drive off into a new life. That's why we're doing it.
There's nothing to be afraid of. And it is sad when you are the ones left behind. There is a sadness there. We understand that. And that can be scary. But the death itself, your transition is very normal. If you're born, we're all going to die. There is nothing to be afraid of. So we are energy without end, like rays of the sun. We are all sparks of the divine, and it's all going to be okay. Welcome, everyone, to That Death Show. I am Ann Kelly, and with me, as always, is the one and only esoteric author, filmmaker, speaker. He is also a new Substacker. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Wyatt. Hi, Tim. How are you?
I'm very well, and very well indeed. And how are you?
I am good. I'm really excited about your new Substack. It is called, again, The Esoteric Perspective. It goes hand in hand with this podcast. If you love what you're getting here, these esoteric wisdoms, the esoteric explanation of everything, the perennial philosophy, this is somewhere you need to be. It's free to sign up if you wish. The Esoteric Perspective on Substack. Make sure you join us over there. Tim, today we're going to be talking about war and death. But really quick, you closed last week's show with a beautiful summation that I'd love if you can revisit, because the whole point of us doing this is not just to wallow in death, and we're not addicted to the horror. It's not that at all. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent. Why are we doing this show, Tim? Tell me.
Because, as John Lennon rightly put it, death is no more important than getting out of one car and getting into another. If we look on the car as the body, then we leave one body, there's a little time in between, and we get into a new car and we drive off into a new life. That's why we're doing it.
There's nothing to be afraid of. And it is sad when you are the ones left behind. There is a sadness there. We understand that. And that can be scary. But the death itself, your transition is very normal. If you're born, we're all going to die. All right. Anybody who's been born before has passed away, and we will go too. There is nothing to be afraid of. So we are energy without end, like rays of the sun. We are all sparks of the divine, and it's all going to be okay. Now, last week, we touched on the worship of death in religions and cultures, and today it's war, the accelerator of death. And really quick, we are a tiny team. And you're looking at the team right now. It's us. So we need your help really quick. If you're enjoying these podcasts, thank you for being here. But we desperately need your help to help get these teachings out into the world where they belong. It's not coming from us. This is the ageless esoteric science. Let's help get them out there. If you can share, subscribe, comment, rate, review, anything. We are working every body part down beyond the marrow. And we love you to death. Thank you so much for all of your help. So war. The accelerator of death. Unfortunately, one of the very first things we ever did as humans, right after making more humans. So, Tim, out of the 195 countries on Earth, how many wars are going on right this second, you think?
Well, the latest estimate is that there are around 110 separate wars going on in the world. Some of these are small tribal or ethnic conflicts. Others are much larger. But when you think that more than 50% of the world is involved in wars of one sort or another, then, this is actually quite frightening. It was perhaps understandable in days of old when people fought with sticks and stones and primitive weapons. But now technology has enabled us to completely destroy ourselves and this planet. And some people find it quite miraculous that we haven't. And we're living in very, very dangerous times at the moment, where we hear about war all the time. And one war ends and another war starts. And it seems that humanity is strangely addicted to this process of ongoing violence and destruction. We don't have other ways of resolving our conflicts, unfortunately.
But there are other ways. And now we are armed with things that could cause absolute damage. And sometimes I believe absolute cataclysmic damage. And I believe that we would deserve that. If we don't knock it off, we don't deserve to have earth and nature. We need to maybe a culling could be the best thing that happens to us because we're not behaving ourselves. We've been fighting since the beginning of time and even before recorded history. You wrote in your notes about, I think I have the wars going back recorded. First recorded war was what, Mesopotamia, 2500 BC or something. But in Atlantis, you're talking about. Now, a lot of people, even watching this death show, will say, oh, there was no Atlantis. But there was a recent study that said that over 50% of people do believe in Atlantis, at least Americans in this survey, but mostly because of modern media and the movies and things like that. But tell us about Atlantis a little bit. It's not far-fetched.
Well, Atlantis was said to be a continent which goes back more than 1 million years and which stretched across large sections of what's now the Atlantic Ocean. And indeed, they have found remnants of it in places like the Bahamas, the Bimini Steppes, which are carved blocks of rock below the surface. Now, Atlantis was originally a single continent, but over many hundreds of thousands of years during various stages of destruction, it fragmented until it became eventually just 2 islands. But it was known that the Atlanteans were a very sophisticated civilization, especially in terms of their technology. And it's known that they did wage wars with other people, and they were a warrior class of beings. And because of their technology, they normally triumphed in these enterprises. But obviously, as Atlantis began to disappear, and before it was finally destroyed, it is said around 12,000 years ago, many of the people from Atlantis had migrated to other parts of the world, South America, North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and brought their ideas and some of their technologies with them. So the Atlanteans were a warlike people, and eventually that warlike quality forced them to divide into 2 separate groups, basically the good guys and the bad guys. There were people using technology and trying to manipulate nature in black magic ceremonies, and then there were people who tried to resist this unsuccessfully, and that, it is said, this black magic practice is what ultimately led to the final demise and destruction of Atlantis.
So it's now going back, we say, to the beginning of recorded history and then beyond, all the way back to what some people don't even believe is history. We've been doing this since we got here. And if we don't wise up and realize that we are not separate from one another, we are not separate. Again, the great heresy, we are not separate from one another. It's like the fingers on a hand fighting to the death between the fingers. They are connected to the one. I just don't understand. And getting a hold of these teachings, these ageless wisdoms, this perennial philosophy, and putting it into application, we can learn and understand and evolve. And possibly we might be able to evolve past war. It is not a glorious thing. I think there was a Banksy not long ago, a couple of years back, I think, that read, "Teach your children that there is no glory or heroes in war. Glory comes from the actions that prevent war. And the heroes, that's you that we're talking to. You are the ones who implement these actions. So it's not glorious. And you have the ability to overcome yourself and overcoming the lower self. I believe, Tim, that these wars are based on the lower self. This is the lower self fighting because it's pride and greed and control.
Well, it's very much about the lower self, and it's almost hardwired into it that we have to resolve conflicts by violent means, whether those conflicts are religious, economic, territorial, political, whatever they happen to be. The default position is war, and we've never really been able to find a way beyond that. We have tried to create organizations like the League of Nations in the 1920s, and after the Second World War, the United Nations. But the nations of the world are not united, and the United Nations is no longer a particularly successful organization in being able to resolve these conflicts. They sit around and they pass resolutions, and the resolutions to whom they apply just say, well, just going to ignore it. We're not interested in that. So they only have a limited amount of influence over world events, and many countries believe that they are beyond the scope of the United Nations. They might be members of it, but it's just like belonging to a bridge club or a bowling club or something. That's all it is.
If we understood that this life is not the only life, that this is just a day, perhaps we wouldn't be doing what we do. I don't understand. Why would you? What are you doing? What are we looking for? So all of a sudden we can have control of this little blue dot for what? One lifetime, obviously, because if you've murdered and raped and pillaged and destroyed to get it, you're going to have to pay for that. Karma and reincarnation, even understanding those, that would be a huge way to stop this behavior. What do you think?
Well, war is always a collective act. It always involves numerous different people. And people in war don't often behave as individuals because armies obviously train their soldiers to conform to orders. However ludicrous and mad those orders might be, they are told that that is their ultimate duty and obligation, is to follow those orders. And certainly at the time of the First World War, there was a widespread feeling amongst people of all classes in Britain. It's my country, right or wrong. We go and fight the Germans, whether it's the right thing to do or whether it's the wrong thing to do, because our country comes first. Now, that mentality has changed to a large degree, and I doubt very much whether that many people would subscribe to that view these days, to that overarching thing, my country, right or wrong, and I'll do anything, providing it's for my country. I don't think that persists anymore, and I'm sure that that is perhaps a positive thing, but it doesn't stop wars. Since 1900, when I was researching this, almost 200 million people have died in wars in the last century and a quarter. And every year, the world spends $2.5 trillion on what it calls defense. And if there was ever a term which was more misapplied than defense, I can't think of one, because it's nothing to do with defense. It's to do with attacking people. And therefore, it's something we have to deeply think about, because it is such a powerful instinct. I doubt whether there has been a day in human history when people haven't gone to war with each other, either on, an individual basis or a more collective basis. It's just something that we do. And it is, as you say, and it's part of the lower animal self that we have, and which, as a priority, human beings now really need to try and go beyond. It's a very difficult ask, because everything in the modern world just plays into that lower self. Its desires, its immediate gratification, its need for instant results about everything, its desire for greed, power, money, and all the other accoutrements of what we call success. But this is just very, very superficial success. It's not success in terms of us growing and developing as human beings. Acquisition and power have nothing to do with that at all, but they remain the powerful drivers of the lower self.
They do. Oh my God. Just thinking about the amount of those deaths and the suffering caused, I guarantee you those that died were not the ones who picked the fight. Those are the innocent. It's the ones sitting back in the bunkers and all that, this pride and greed and selfishness and all of that. That's what just makes my blood boil. It has been going on since the beginning of time, and it too is a cycle, is it not? So we have cause and effect, dark and light, evil and good, war and peace. This is a cycle. And we actually have the ability to stop this. If we don't, we're going to learn the hard way, or we could learn the easy way. And that would be by overcoming ourselves. To destroy others, this is a self-inflicted wound. We are all threads. We are all of us are connected. You hear that all the time. It sounds so pie in the sky and new agey. All are one. But very few people actually live that way. We are all part of the same thing. We're all tapestries, warp and weft in a cosmic tapestry, and we continue to wage war against ourselves. But Tim, since we've been at war since the beginning of time, wouldn't this then be perhaps the karma playing out of wars prior? Weird question, but what are your thoughts?
Well, one war produces another. When they had the peace treaty of Versailles after the First World War, it was so punitive against Germany that it effectively sowed the seeds for what would eventually become the Second World War. Had there been a more equitable resolution of that, and had Herr Hitler been able to sell some of his paintings in Vienna, then there would have been no such thing as the Nazi Party or the Second World War. So one thing does produce another. And there are many esoteric writers who have spoken about how wars also have this effect of karmically purging individuals or peoples, and that people who are conquered might come back eventually collectively to punish their conquerors. And we can look at various examples of this. It's often said that perhaps the conquistadors who were so rampant and ravaging in South and Central America, destroying cultures, stealing wealth, that they may well have become victims in future conflicts. So all this is not just about individual karma, it's about collective karma of groups, of nations, of civilizations as well. And so something that happens at one point might not play out physically for another 100 years or even longer, but eventually it will, because this karma has to be resolved in some way. So all wars have a deeply karmic element to them. I mean, not only do they shape things politically and geographically and historically, they also leave this strong karmic imprint, which has some time to be played out. So we have to break this cycle somehow. And how you do that, I have no idea. I have no idea how we break this cycle.
It would be by each of us, this is my understanding, each of us being self-accountable. We analyze ourselves, we overcome our lower selves. Each of us individually, that's all we have control over. We don't have control over anybody else or anything else or any external circumstance, but we do have control over ourselves. And through the application of the teachings of perennial philosophy, understanding that I can overcome when I feel rage or fear or greed or selfishness, I recognize that and I try to overcome it with a higher self the best I can. It's never mastered, always in practice. But also, I'm thinking the karma also, through great suffering, we can bring forth compassion and service to others. So through these wars, that also could be a way of karma balancing that we've been fighting since the beginning of time. Because suffering is a catalyst to spiritual awakening, and wars cause great suffering. So how would you think, if you actually were put on the spot right now, somebody came up to you with a mic and said, listen, how do we stop fighting wars? And I know you say you don't have the answer, but what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, people should look at what wars do to people. No one who is involved in a war, whether they are wounded or not, comes out unscathed and uninjured. The psychological effects of war, we only have to see how many service personnel around the world suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and various other things as well. We saw this first after the Second World War, and then during that monstrous conflict, the Vietnam War, we saw young men coming back whose lives had been destroyed, not because they were physically injured, but because they'd seen so many things, and it was just an overload for any normal person to have to deal with. I mean, wars are not glorious, and wars don't show necessarily anything good about people. They often show the worst things about people. Obviously, there are great acts of heroism. There are great acts of altruism and kindness in wars, as there is in normal times. But also wars collectively bring out the worst in people. People will do things in wars because they're told to, and because they are conditioned by their training to do that, and because they are reinforced by those around them. Any soldier fighting a war is ultimately not fighting for his country or for an ideology. He's fighting for the men around him, for his squadron or battalion. That's the most important thing to him in a time of conflict, not any higher ideology. He has to work as part of that immediate team. And it's a human imperative not to want to fail or to be looked on as a coward or someone who is ineffective when there is a time of crisis. And so it's a very powerful drive to force people to do this. I was watching a documentary last night, actually, about the First World War and how there was a call in August 1914 for people to join up. And so many people wanted to join up, the authorities could hardly cope with it because so many people wanted to get onto that battlefield. As I said earlier, the attitudes and the mentality which prevailed then are not necessarily the same as now, but the fundamental aspects of all this are precisely the same, and we are being talked up into war in this country now. There are military leaders who are saying we have to prepare for war with Russia in the next 4 or 5 years. Is this the one they've got planned for us, I wonder?
I don't know. I just wish that we would learn from our mistakes. I don't understand why we don't. And many throughout the history of these wars, many of them go, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. God is on our side. And so let us go slaughter, murder, torture, and maim and annihilate these people because God is on our side. What role do you believe religion plays in wars?
Religion has played a very central role in wars. Indeed, religion has caused many wars. You've only got to look at the Catholic Church and the number of conflicts that it caused throughout the centuries, starting with the Crusades, going through the Inquisition, the invasion of foreign lands, the destruction of cultures, the plundering of wealth, and all the rest of it. Religions love to fight wars, particularly amongst themselves. We saw how much conflict there was between the Catholic and Protestant churches in Europe, and particularly in Britain, during preceding centuries. We see how even in places like Northern Ireland today, there are Catholics and Protestants. I don't think many of them go to church, and I don't think many of them are very devout. So religion then becomes almost like a tribal thing rather than anything to do with a particular spiritual belief. And then religions like to go to war with other religions. That's what the Crusades were all about. So religion is intimately wrapped up in many of the conflicts which we've seen throughout history.
So we're going to torture you to death to prove that we are the most peaceful and loving religion on the planet. And that is just absurd to me, still absurd. Again, one of the reasons why we're doing this show, to bring you these ancient esoteric teachings, to understand it's not divisive. Religion divides. These are the fundamental cores, the commonalities of all the world's religions, sciences, and philosophies. And by applying them, you can learn how to live. They're instruction manuals for life. And we don't want you to be afraid of death. We're all going to die. We don't have to. By overcoming ourselves, this is what my understanding is how we can make the world a better place. We only have control over ourselves. I know you mentioned something about the violent death on the battlefield for these young men and now women. Can you expand a little bit about the souls reincarnating after I don't want to say premature because it did happen, but an early death and a violent death on the battlefield and the reincarnations directly afterwards? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. In traditional wars, the largest number of casualties tend to be amongst young men. This is changing and has changed because there are now much larger numbers of civilians who get caught up in these things, who are not direct combatants in those wars, but who happen to be what the military call collateral damage. They are just the victims on the sidelines, as it were. But it is said that young people who die in wars, or often in other violent ways, the soul has a tendency to want to come back into physical form relatively quickly. So it's often said that people who die in these conflicts, the young men principally, will want to reincarnate within a few years and not go through the normal after-death processes, which might take hundreds of years. It's their imperative to get back into a physical body because the previous existence was curtailed by being killed in a war. And this is why you tend to see baby booms after major wars. It certainly happened after the Second World War and to an extent after the First World War. Because after the First World War, there were many women who could never find a man because there weren't enough men to go around anymore. And so this is what seems to happen. And many people who've had past life regressions or memories of past lives have attested to this, that they wanted to get back into physical form as soon as possible because they felt cheated in some way. So this may go to explain why there was this baby boom of which I am a part. People born from 1945 to 1955, those of us who've now reached pensionable age. And so I think this is what does happen. I think it's very natural for a soul if it's been interrupted, because if it dies at the age of 18, then that's not very much of a life to process in the after-death states. And it's necessary to come back and get more living experience on this earth, rather than floating around in the indeterminate realms for a while.
And come back and finish what you started. I totally understand. There's so much to our stories. It's true. They say there's a famous saying that says, wars are a reflection of our own inner conflicts. When we heal ourselves, we heal the world. It's true. Through the study, application, and digestion of what we're talking about here on That Death Show, again, not our opinions, not coming from us. These are the ageless wisdoms. Through self-reflection, through application, through self-correction, we can move beyond our primal, deep-rooted selfishness, which is very human, ignorance, very human. We can shift our consciousness towards unity and selflessness. So, Tim, any final thoughts on wars and death?
Well, it does seem that war is one of humanity's favorite pastimes, and we see it symbolically go on every weekend. When football teams play each other, that's a kind of symbolic war. And then when the fans fight with each other outside the stadium, that's another version of that war. So it seems that this need for conflict and triumph over our supposed enemies or rivals is something that we have hardwired into us, and which we find it very, very difficult to escape, because it is about the lower self. The lower self is competitive. The lower self is based on this tiny little ego, which is here for one life, but it thinks it's important. It thinks it's more important than its higher version up there. And this is something that we have to learn. And I don't know whether we will learn it in time. I hope we will.
I hope we will too. And that's again, why we're doing what we're doing. If you love what you hear here and you want to know more, you can always check out Tim's Substack, which is the Esoteric Perspective. He writes on this stuff all the time. Again, it doesn't have to come from us. You can go online, read Plato. You can go online and go to these libraries and get a hold of all of these ageless wisdoms. If you want to know more, I always put links down below. But again, Tim's new Substack goes hand in hand with this podcast. It's called The Esoteric Perspective. And there's always links inside there, like to Eddie's work and all of the ageless teachings. They're in there. And there's links online. You have all the libraries in the world at your fingertips. So we're just a tiny, tiny bit trying to be of service and working our fingers to the bone to get this podcast out there to those who want to find comfort and eliminate the fear surrounding death. So again, the Esoteric Perspective on Substack. We hope to see you there. And again, one of the inspirations for this podcast is Tim's documentary. It came out in the summer. It's called The Myth of Death. And it is the most comforting film I have ever watched. And it's free. You can watch it right now. Go to our channel, That Death Show on YouTube. You can watch it. It's also taken over the film festivals. Congratulations on last month at the Hermetic International Film Festival. That is a very big deal. There's more festivals coming up that you're in the run-up for. So we're very excited about that. And remember, if you'd like to get a copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead, check that out at firewheelbooks.co.uk, because Tim says that the Egyptians have a Book of the Dead, the Tibetans have a Book of the Dead, and now you have a Book of the Dead. It's called Everyone's Book of the Dead. So your support means so much to us. Please, please, please help us get the word out there by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, rating, anything to get it off the ground. There's a lot of podcasts out there. This is a labor of love, and it is just Tim and I. So thank you so much. We love you to death. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. And next week, finally, we will have the one and only Dr. B, the author of Unfolding Consciousness, Exploring the Living Universe and the Intelligent Powers in Nature and Humans. He has worked together with Tim on a new book that is coming out at the end of 2025 in December of this year. We will have Consciousness Came First, Tim, would you like to say anything about that fantastic project? Just a little teaser before next week.
Well, Eddie's book is one of the most panoramic accounts of consciousness ever written, and it runs to 4 very heavy volumes, which are heavy enough if you drop them out of a window to kill someone. So
It's
we
true.
thought this is an excellent book for specialists and for academics, and it's absolutely unrivaled. But the ideas in it are also of interest to the common reader. So I set about the task of reducing around 750,000 words to 75,000 words, or a 200-page, 250-page paperback, so that people with no prior scientific, philosophical, esoteric knowledge can readily understand these ideas. And Eddie's ultimate message is you don't need a brain to have consciousness, and consciousness, as the title suggests, did come first and is the responsibility for everything else and is the cause of everything else.
Oh, brilliantly said. I'm looking forward to next week with Eddie and with you. We're all very dedicated students. We work together all the time, and it's about time we got him on the show. Really looking forward to it. Thank you for being with us on this episode about war. And remember, you can overcome yourself. You overcome yourself. That changes the whole world. The whole world will change. And I love you, and we'll see you next week with Dr. B. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Death comes to us all, but death is not a tragedy. Everyone's Book of the Dead by Tim Wyatt reveals a whole new perspective on what lies beyond this earthly life. The Egyptians have a Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have a Book of the Dead. Shouldn't you have one too? This captivating, richly illustrated book explores the mystery of death by examining it from every angle, sharing the ageless esoteric teachings on karma, reincarnation, and after-death states, as well as examining death and dying in different cultures, religions, and spiritual traditions. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent, but simply a transitional doorway to a new beginning. Get your copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead today at firewheelbooks.co.uk.